And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive. And from a hole in the roof smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed. What do you think it means by chiefly noticed? Think about a chief. But Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river there was another small river which came down another small valley to join it. And looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure they were the two small hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamppost that other day. And then between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight and about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself. And horrible ideas came into his head. What horrible ideas do you think might come into his head? And also, can you predict what Edmund's going to do next? Here we are, said Mr. Beaver, and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip. The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk, because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file, right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. Here we are, Mrs. Beaver, said Mr. Beaver. I found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burring sound. Ooh. What could be the reason for that? And the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from it that the sound came. There's a picture there of her sitting on her sewing machine. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. What relation do you think this beaver working on the sewing machine is to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver? So you've come at last, she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. At last! To think that ever I should live to see this day. What does she mean? The potatoes are boiling and the kettle singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish. That I will, said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. A hatchet is a type of like knife or something to make a hole in the ice. They took a pail with them. Oh, that's an old-fashioned word, pail. Think about the song Jack and Jill. That'll help you with words like the word pail. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. He looked hard into it, then suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson had whisked out a beautiful trout. Do we know what a trout is? Word's that trout. Think about what were they going to look for? What could trout be? Then he did it all over again until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to put on the frying pan and get the dripping hot. Dripping is like an oil to cook in. Lucy thought the beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, but instead of beds there were bunks, like on board a ship, and they were all built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof. And against the walls were gumboots, they're like Wellingtons, and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar and fishing rods and fishing nets and sacks. So why does the beaver have Wellingtons and knives and shears and spades and trowels? What do we already know about the beaver? Why has he got all those things? And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was hissing nicely, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the newly caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they had become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and then put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago and has come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and gloriously sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool so as to be able to lean against the wall and gave a long sigh of contentment. Why are they feeling contentment? What does contentment mean if you're contented? And there's the picture of them. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors." Why would they not have any visitors if it's starting to snow again? "And if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." So can you predict what's going to happen in the next chapter? What is Mr. Beaver going to tell the children next? Right, thank you for listening. I'm going to go and finish my cup of tea, and I shall see you tomorrow. Have a lovely day. Bye.